All right. I think it's time to go ahead and get started. Thanks everyone for being on tonight's call. My name is Chris Licarpio. We are the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and we are going to talk tonight about why we are saying no to war on Venezuela, why we are saying yes to the national liberation struggle and revolutionary movement in Venezuela, and what we're going to do about it. We're going to hear from some very exciting speakers tonight. We're going to hear from Meredith Aby from the Anti-War Action Network. We're going to hear from Carlos Montes from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization's Central Committee, Tom Burke, the Organizational Secretary of the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and Jim Byrne from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization in Tucson, Arizona. So speakers will present, but then we'll also, like we have for these calls, for people who get on them every quarter, we'll have our question and answer so people can contribute questions to ask our panelists. The way that people can do that tonight, by the way, is if you'll see that you're not going to be able to write in the big chat, but if you hit new chat next to everyone, kind of on the right-hand side, you can send your question to a moderator. Please send your questions to me and to Andy. So that's how we'll do it tonight, okay? So for the question and answer, and you can send them throughout the presentation. We'll make sure that our speakers get to them before the night ends. So thanks everyone for being on our call. I think we'll go ahead and officially I'll say a few words before we open it up to our speakers. So tonight we're going to have a very important discussion and hear about the steady drumbeat that the U.S. has been beating towards war with Venezuela, lasting in the short term 22 weeks, but in a lot of ways much longer than that. Right. So killings of the fishermen and sailors in boats, but also in the background sanctions, starvation. Over 83 people at least have been killed in the waters of the Caribbean and the Pacific as part of the US's agenda towards accelerating a war with Venezuela. Trump has made references to the Monroe Doctrine, right? Taking back the Panama Canal, the new Department of War's budget proposal saying that the Western Hemisphere is a top priority. For them, Venezuela is the tip of the spear. We're seeing war crimes, shooting down not only those boats, but even doing the so-called secondary double tap strike of survivors clinging to the wreckage of their ship, war crimes so deplorable that even Pete Hegseth and White House Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt want to pass the buck and blame the admirals instead. So why is the U.S. acting this way? It's because Venezuela refuses to stand down. They insist on their right to wage a revolutionary national liberation struggle and to have the rightfully elected president of Venezuela, uh, Nicolas Maduro, calls peace with dignity. And we, as revolutionaries in the U.S., have a duty to uphold their right to that sovereignty and to have their national liberation struggle to be free um, and to determine their own destiny. So we're going to hear about that tonight, and I'm excited to pass it on just in a moment to our speakers. We're going to talk about what we're going to do about it and why the wars of Trump and the billionaires and the imperialists hold down the people of the US as well as terrorize the peoples of the world. And as part of our strategy for a united front against imperialism, we're going to take the whole beast down. So first for the night, I'm going to pass it to Meredith Aby from the Anti-War Action Network to go ahead and start us off. Take it away, Meredith.
Thank you, Chris Lee. The U.S. empire has been trying to overthrow the government of Venezuela since Chavez was elected and took office in 1999. So for 25 years now, Presidents Chavez and Maduro have faced coups, infrastructure sabotage, election interference, computer hacking, system hacking, mercenary invasions, drone attacks, and painful economic sanctions. And despite all of this, from the Clinton administration to the second Trump administration, the Venezuelan people have been incredibly strong. They have rebuilt their economy. They have reelected candidates time and time again that the US has told them, don't vote for them. Don't vote for them. And they now still continue to control their own oil that the US wants so desperately and is basically like drooling after. The Democrats, the Republicans, and the ruling class have been frustrated and angry that their so very cruel sanctions have not caused the regime change that they so desperately desire. And now the US is turning to overt war in order to get what they want. President Trump says he wants to replace President Maduro. To do this, Trump and Secretary of State Marco Rubio need to paint Venezuela's leadership as worthy of overturning. So now they're claiming that there's this vast conspiracy of political and military leaders that are involved in drug trafficking. However, the United Nations reports that drug crops are not grown in Venezuela. Very little is transported. Like there's actually not evidence that this is true. There's not evidence that Venezuela is a threat to the United States. But what we're seeing is that there's just this repetition of like if we just say it enough times, it'll be true. And it kind of reminds me of like Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. That it's like we're just going to keep saying it so often, that's just going to get repeated in the news so often that like obviously it must be true. And so there's this propaganda campaign that's happening on the part of the Trump administration. And we, as the anti-war movement and if people of conscience, we have an important role to combat this propaganda campaign because we have to be like, actually, that's not true. What Trump and Rubio want is they want their own lackeys in power, but the new lackeys that they want will only have one job, and that will be serving the bidding of oil companies and the United States and Wall Street investors. But the reality is, Wall Street, Venezuelans, not Wall Street, should get to pick their own leaders, and it doesn't matter it doesn't matter what Trump feels about their choices, okay? Most recently, Trump announced a no-fly zone, and I think it's really important that we understand that this is an escalation. No-fly zone sounds like really pretty and nonviolent, and I just think it's super important for you to understand that this is an escalation. Um, the U.S. used a no-fly zone during its war in Iraq, and what happened is that somebody has to enforce a no-fly zone. That means that any planes that fly in a no-fly zone are shot down by the US military. Like that's pretty violent. And so what it means is that like Venezuela would lose control of its own airspace. Okay. And it also would mean that a country that is already under economic siege would now lose the ability for anyone else to be able to fly in to provide relief or to visit it or to document any sort of human rights abuses that are happening because of, the conditions that the US is creating. And so I think that's important. Um, and so the anti-war movement needs to see and treat Trump's no-fly zone as an act of war. And so we need to talk to people about this as an escalation, not as, sort of like, just sort of another thing. Like I think it's important to understand that like this terminology doesn't sound as threatening as it actually is. The U.S. Navy does not have the right to be judge, jury, and executioner of boats in the Caribbean. These are war crimes, and Hegseth should be like arrested and prosecuted for these. And I actually think it's incredibly good. I've been actually excited this week listening to mainstream news coverage. Like normally I listen to mainstream news coverage and I'm really frustrated and I just want to like throw my car radio and pull it out and throw it out the window. But like they've used words like war crimes on the news media. I'm like, oh my gosh, these people are actually saying things that make sense. And they're like saying that there were probably war crimes that were committed. Some people have said there were war crimes that were committed. Some people have been saying there's actually a cover up that's happening. And I'm just like, oh my gosh, there's actually sound bites that are getting through that make sense. And so that has been really exciting that there's actually a conversation happening about the right things in Congress. Who knew? And so I think that it's pretty exciting that like there's actually a conversation happening about the fact that this is a war crime. And so that means that like we have an opportunity here, right? The ruling class in Congress is actually split and they're actually debating this issue amongst themselves. And so we have an opportunity to sort of move our agenda forward, and we've got to take advantage of that. CBS News reported that a majority of both Democrats and Republicans don't feel like Trump has actually explained the reasoning to justify a war with Venezuela. We need to counter his lack of a message with our message. We need to provide a message of opposition. In a poll from The Economist, which is a horrible news source and like super conservative, and I never agree with anything I read in there, but in The Economist, which is a piece of trash, it says only 45% of Americans support overthrowing Maduro. Okay. So, like, They can't even come up with numbers higher than 45%. So this is a great place to build on. And the other speakers on the panel tonight are going to give you stories and points to use to counter all this negative propaganda that people have heard about Maduro and the Bolivarian Revolution. Um, Minnesota's own Senator Amy Klobuchar, I can't stand her. She's a horrible voting record, unlike everything. Um, Especially on foreign policy. But on this issue right now, she's actually voting the right way. So, like, we have an opportunity to talk to mainstream Democrats. We have an opportunity to talk to people in the 50-51 crowd, the No Kings crowd, the Indivisible crowd. And so, this is an opportunity to sort of be growing our movement and sort of bringing people in and sort of building this level of pressure because we can stop this war. And I think that's what's really important for people to understand. We've got numbers on our side, but we need to organize them and sort of push them into doing something. My last point I want to talk to you about is that we also need to reach out to the Palestine solidarity movement. We need to make sure that the activists that we have mobilized since October 7th are consistent anti-imperialists. Many of the people that we've been organizing with since October 7th are new activists, and some of them are anti-imperialists, but some of them are actually anti-genocide activists and don't see the instrumental role of US imperialism as central to creating the death and destruction internationally that we have seen since October 7th. Working on Venezuela gives them an opportunity to understand that it's not just that like Palestine is this case study of this horrible thing that happened. That is actually this is part of a design. This is what imperialism does. And the US is at the center of that. And so this gives us an opportunity to sort of give people an understanding of that. Um, it is the U.S. that provides Israel these weapons to kill Palestinians, and the U.S. can actually tell Israel to stop. Across the globe in the Caribbean, it is the U.S. that decides who lives and who dies on fishing boats for the crime of trying to feed their own families. In both places, the U.S. is motivated by its geopolitical desire to control things and to control, resources. The U.S. uses Israel to control the broader Middle East, and the U.S. um, uses the top of South America to control the trade routes through Panama and access to the rest of the continent. For decades, Colombia was actually the Israel of Latin America, but it is no longer under the thumb of the United States. And so we have an opportunity to sort of develop, um, you know, the new activists that have come forward since October 7th. And I think Venezuela gives us that opportunity. Um, as someone with a WAN, the Anti-War Action Network, we'd really like to encourage you to join with us on the week of December 7th through 12th. That's our action week for Human Rights Day. That gives us an excellent opportunity to draw connections between what's going on in Palestine and Venezuela, as well as what's going on at home with things like ICE. And to get people into the streets, we really want to have people not do educational events for that week. We really think that it's actions in the street. We really need to show that there's an increase of level of public outrage because that's it's going to take to stop this war before it starts. And so we really encourage you to be a part of that raising level of momentum in this country. Thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this event. I'm going to turn it back over to Chrisley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. And I hope people are writing that down in their calendars, actions in the street on Human Rights Day. I think Meredith has spelled it out. This is a deeply unpopular war. It's only for the Wall Street billionaires and Trump and his cronies. He's their puppet, right? And it's beginning to show. All the social movements that have condemned US-backed wars and genocide have brought us to this point where we can grow this movement. We should do everything we can everything in our power to grow this movement and take advantage of the fact that the imperialists can't even agree on how to defend it. So we'll go next to Carlos Montes from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization Central Committee, one of our very exciting leaders. Go ahead, take it away, Carlos.
Thank you very much, Chris Lee, and thanks to everyone that's logged in today. It's awesome to see all you out there, all you activists that are fighting to defeat U.S. imperialism. Yes, I joined Freedom Road Socialist Organization 30 years ago because I agree that the main enemy of the people of the world is U.S. imperialism, and we have to defeat U.S. imperialism. U.S. imperialism has tried to use South America, Mexico, Latin, Central America as its own backyard. Now they're saying it's their front yard, right? There's been countless military overthrows of governments in Latin America, right? Mexico was invaded 3 times by the U.S. Military, right? They invaded Santo Domingo, the U.S. Marines in 65. And remember, in 1989, the United States government used a stealth bomber to bomb Panama City, killing thousands of Panamanians. And they invaded only the reason to arrest Rafael Noriega. But remember that many of the elite forces that invaded Panama also died. So Meredith, thank you very much for that awesome presentation. I was in Venezuela in 2023 for the 10-year anniversary of the passing of Hugo Chavez, and it was awesome. I met working class men and women, especially the Afro-Latinos, who love the Hugo Chavez and who love the current Maduro government, right? I went to many activities. I walked downtown with another young folks, right? And I observed that the city was working. People were going to school. People were taking the bus. The whole city was functioning, right? And I didn't see what I see in downtown LA. I see in the downtown LA, I see thousands of homeless people on drugs, overdosing, homelessness, unemployment. Of course, I see, crime, drugs, and gang warfare. I didn't see any of that in Venezuela. I know people are saying, oh, Carlos, you were only there for 10 days, right? But look, I've been in many cities. I've been in Mexico City. I've been in Colombia. I've been in Cuba. And I can tell when things are happening, right? I will say that the Bolivarian Revolution and the legacy of Hugo Chavez and the continuation of the Bolivarian Revolution, I saw dozens and dozens of apartment buildings, right? I visited the pharmacy, which was loaded with all kinds of medicine, and you'll never know where it's made, right? I got a little sick. I had a doctor come to my hotel, Afro-Latino doctor. They give me the COVID test. They examine me, give me medication. This would never happen in the United States, right? So the Bolivarian Revolution that started with Hugo Chavez has implemented massive infrastructure development, schools, clinics, free education, and housing. Literally, I saw all these apartments, and I told the cab driver, "Hey, look at what I would love to live there." It was up in the hills, overlooking the ocean. I've been to Seattle, to Denver, to San Jose, and I see dozens and dozens of apartment buildings in downtown, right? And they're all market rate, expensive apartment. Even here where I live in Ball Heights, there's dozens of apartments going up, 3 stories, 5 stories. They're all market rate. That is totally different from what I saw in Venezuela, right? I will also say that when I was in Venezuela, I got a chance to meet Evo Morales, in the cafeteria. I took pictures with him. We love him. I got a chance to sit like 5 rows up from Nicolas Maduro, right? And I saw how the people greeted him and loved him, and he turned around and greeted everyone. And I mean, the opposition there has very little support, right? I will also say that I want to point out that this whole thing that they're accusing him of being a narco terrorist, it's all a CIA Trump plot to overthrow the government. What do they want? I think Meredith forgot to say that Venezuela has the biggest oil reserve in the world. Okay, in the world, more than Saudi Arabia and Iran and all the other Middle East countries, right? Trump and the bourgeoisie, the super rich, all they want is the oil. When Hugo Chavez came to power, he expropriated the oil industry, made sure that the oil revenues is for the benefit of Venezuelans. And he's also, used, trade oil, not traded, but provided oil support to other countries like Nicaragua and Cuba, even some of the other Caribbean countries, right? So U.S. imperialism is a dog, right? I mean, the people in Venezuela, I met so many people, and I like to talk to folks, right? And they are organized. They have a whole system of communes or collectives, you could say communes, that recently they had a national, a popular consultation where they had meetings. These communes have meetings, they have elections, they decide what kind of projects they want to implement in their neighborhood. I was a president of the LA City Boyle Neighborhood Council for about a year, right? And we all we had is advisory power. We didn't have any power to really do things, But these communes that are organized all over Venezuela, and there's over 5,000 communes all over the country. This is real people power. This is the power of the people in Venezuela. And these are the same people that will defend their country. Recently, there's been massive demonstrations in support of Venezuela, denouncing Trump, that they will fight to the end to the death for their sovereignty and self-determination of Venezuela. Now, I also, I'm an anti-war activist. Came out of the Chicano moratorium. I became radicalized during the Vietnam War, but I'm also an immigrant rights activist. And I always point out that mass misery, mass migration of people throughout the world, whether it's Africa, Asia, Latin America, especially, Mexico, Central America, is caused by U.S. intervention, U.S. imperialism. And we have to denounce U.S. imperialism causing the misery. And what's happening today in our cities, in L.A. and Chicago, now it's happening in the Carolinas, where Trump is using the racist apparatus of the federal government, ICE, FBI, to attack poor working class Chicanos, Mexicanos, Central Americans, and Venezuelans, right? That was caused by U.S. imperialism. So this is a major contradiction. I think the United States is being isolated throughout the world, not only because of support of Israel, but what it's doing to its own working class people here in the United States, right? So again, I'll point out that this is just a CIA military plot to overthrow the government, to go for the oil, and the people will not be defeated. So thank you all for being on this call, and I'll wrap it up. I'll just say that I'm going back to Venezuela. Yeah, we got to be there in solidarity, and all of you out there, organize your community, do protests, educate people. Because sometimes some of my friends, oh, Carlos, what do you care about Venezuela? Look, man, we got to always be in solidarity with the oppressed nations of the world. That's why I mentioned earlier that I've been to Colombia, to Cuba. I was in even Nicaragua a couple of years ago, and I got treated better in those countries than I get treated in my own city by the authorities. So we have to show our solidarity with Venezuela, denounce U.S. empire, and organize in our communities. Thank you very much. I'll wrap it up. I know I forgot something to say, but I'll wait for the question and answer period. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chrisley.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carlos. And thanks for that glimpse into the window of what life is like there. You're right. We can't imagine it in the US, them trying to provide, affordable free housing, defeat illiteracy, provide medical care, in the style of Cuban socialism. I can't even picture it. And I hope that we have it one day in the US. And I don't think we're going to stop trying either. So next we will go to our third speaker of the night. We'll hear from Tom Burke, our organizational secretary in the FRSO. Go ahead, Tom.
Thank you. Thank you, Chris Lee. Solidarity, everyone. Good to see you all here. Thanks for showing up, and thanks for going out on the streets to rally and protest to stop this war in solidarity with the people of Venezuela and the Caribbean and the rest of the world, actually. So I'm going to talk about the United Socialist Party of Venezuela, the PSUV. A few years ago, I was able to attend their fifth Congress. There's a Honduran trade unionist there. He kept jokingly calling me the Gringo Chavista. So there were people from Latin America, the Central America, the Caribbean. I was the sole North American invited, and I was proud to represent the Freedom Road Socialist Organization there. And what I saw was a big conference hall. I don't know if it was 3,000 or 5,000, but it was a lot of people. And they were in transition as a party. And what they were celebrating was that they had become a majority women in the hall in the leadership of the party, and that about 1/3 of their membership was 35 years old or younger. And I hear that the average age now is 35 for their party. So there was a big focus on, the previous few years. I believe it was 3-year period of bringing in young people and activating women's leadership to put them in charge of things, and not just at the community level or the workplace level, but also starting to change the top leadership as well through a process of transformation. So it was exciting to be there. And in many ways, it made me think about party building for the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. We're doing great. We have a lot of new members, as you can see on this call. And we're doing exciting things, leading many struggles around immigrant rights, around Black Lives Matter, in the trade unions, in the student movement, in the anti-war movement. We're strong and we're growing and people are joining every day. But we also need to study and look at other parties' experiences to understand how we're going to become a party of the working class, of the American workers, to lead a revolution in our country. Maybe similar, maybe different to Venezuela, but we can learn lessons from them too. So just to go a little bit back in history, in '89 there was something called the Caracazo, and that was street rebellions against the government of the time. And just so you understand, Venezuela was fairly industrialized compared to most of Latin America and had a fairly developed economy, a modern economy. But through the 70s and 80s, it began to decline because that's what imperialism does to countries. It's a vampire who's sucking the blood out of society. And so as that process went on, even though social democratic parties were the main players and mostly the governments elected, there began to be rebellions against them. So when you hear Bernie Sanders or Mamdani call President Maduro a dictator or an authoritarian, you remember the Social Democrats were the ones who got overthrown in Venezuela by the Bolivarian Revolution. It wasn't just right wingers. And so from that Caracazo, Chavez led a military uprising, not a coup d'etat. He didn't want to just seize power because he could have done that. He wanted to have a people's uprising, a mass uprising. And they had attempted from the perch of the military to reach all the left parties and revolutionary movements and mass groups that they thought would participate. But it didn't work out. So he surrendered himself and went to prison. And then the next crisis came along and he was able to get the movement to release him and force the president to release him. And that's when he started running for office and won the election in 1999, as Meredith said. And that was a big surprise, not just to the ruling class in Venezuela and not just to the US and the CIA. It was a surprise to a lot of the left parties that didn't really work that hard on his campaign. He went out and met with them, and he decided he would go around most of them because they weren't enthusiastic about running a campaign. So the left in the country had to run and play catch up with Chavez and the Bolivarian movement. It wasn't until 2007 that they actually formed a party, and that's the PSUV. And that was a big step forward because to advance a revolution, you have to have a party, an army and a united front. And the army was where the revolution was emanating from. And they built an alliance with the civilian movements. And that's what Maduro represents in the scheme of things. So you have the civilian military alliance. But as they developed party, um, they had to consolidate the movements and give leadership to things. So that's where the PSUV came from. The core of leaders, I remember studying it at the time, and I have friends who are in Venezuela and comrades. Um, it's fair to say that most of the leaders came from Marxist-Leninist parties of the 70s and 80s. Some people reached back to the national liberation movements of the 1960s, where they were trying to do like what Che and Fidel did in Cuba in the 60s. But many of them, like Delcy Rodriguez, the vice president, and her brother Jorge, their father was the founder and leader of a movement called the Socialist League. And he was actually organizing, urban trade unionist community groups, different sectors of society, the student movement. And the police captured him in the early 70s. And after 3 weeks, he was found dead in a cell because they tortured him and murdered him. So when you see Delcy Rodriguez or Jorge Rodriguez, who are often in the news, they know full well what the revolution is about. They've lived it their whole lives, and their father's one of the main martyrs. So the people from those parties formed the core of the PSUV back in 2007, along with the revolutionaries of the military. And you'll meet people, in full Army or Navy uniforms. And if you're talking with them, you find out, well, they're actually generals. Or one time we got to talk to the chief of staff because he was excited to tell us about his trip to New York with Chavez and how he had been banned from returning to New York. He was very proud of that. But they'll tell you, oh, I'm a Marxist Leninist, and they'll explain to you their life experience, even though they've been in the military for 30 years or 20 years, And that's a little bit different than what I've experienced in other places, especially in the US. So understand that the military is at the core of the revolution. So today you have a party that's, a party of hundreds of thousands of people organizing millions of other people. And they do it through different organizational forms, but they have something called the Units of Battle of Hugo Chavez, which they talked about a lot 3 years ago as a basic core element in communities, workplaces, on campuses, throughout government, institutions. And it's the basic core group of organizing for the party. And those people are responsible to mobilize people for elections. But it's not only electoral party, They don't describe it as a Marxist-Leninist party. They say it's a party of 21st century socialism, that it uses the ideas of Marx and Lenin and other revolutionaries, Che and Mao and Ho Chi Minh, others like that. But it's also bringing in other strands of thought. So ideologically, it's a little bit different than what we do. And it's the party of the National Democratic Revolution. So they say they want to transform to socialism, and that's their goal. But they currently still have an economy that's mainly in private hands. And so they have some work to do to transform society. So that's what the party is also working at. It intersects with all the comunas, all the communes. It also intersects with the new trade union federations that are being formed in the coming weeks. And we plan to send a couple of comrades there to observe that and participate in the elections of their new trade union leadership. So they're going to really transform things, and the PSUV plays a role at all these levels, different than the state or different than the mass movements. It's where the ideas are brought into practice. All right. So, of course, the head of this is Nicolas Maduro, the bus driver, who they call the worker president proudly, and a former union leader. So, in the future, if the FRSO has any bus driver union presidents, we better keep an eye on them. They might end up doing something terrific, you know? Um, so, I'm going to say that another element of the PSUV is this idea of protagonistic democracy that Carlos kind of hit on, that it's not just about voting and then hoping the representatives do what right is right. It's participating. You know, when the right wing tries to overthrow the revolution, we met union workers at the electric company. And they said, "Oh, you see these highways behind our building? The right wingers came there with rifles and started shooting at us." And we were like, "So what'd you do?" They said, "Well, we went to our lockers and got our rifles and started shooting back at them, and they ran away." So these militias have been organized for decades now. The revolution's 25 years old, and it's not going to go away. It's not going to be pushed over easily by, Hegseth and Rubio and Trump. They are not going to win this. And solidarity is the key for us. So I'll end it there. But we have to do our job here to help stop a war. We helped organize a big event in New York City with the foreign minister of Venezuela during UN week. Very successful event. We're going to make history alongside the peoples of Latin America and the Caribbean and defend the Bolivarian Revolution. Thank you, comrades.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tom. And thanks for talking to us about the shining example of a national liberation revolution that is Venezuela, right? Revolutionaries who are learning from Marxist-Leninists just like we are. Um, and you talking about how it's possible for us to uh, kind of make a big dent in the effort to go to war and actually kind of win this reminded me of the role that we played in getting out Alex Saab, who was a businessman and a diplomat who the U.S. kidnapped, who was on a mission to arrange better trade deals for Venezuela, get around the sanctions, and we actually had protests, and he got free. That actually happened. We can actually, we should do whatever we can and keep trying. And now for the final speaker of the night, let's hand it off to Jim Byrne from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization and also in Arizona. And just a reminder to people to send us your questions, please, because after this we'll have question and answer. And I'm so excited to hand it off to Jim to take us home.
Right on. Thanks, Chris Lee, and thanks to all the speakers before and everybody here tonight. Having been to Venezuela twice, I lived there for 6 months a while ago. It means a lot to me to see that, knowing that there's people there very near and dear to my heart who are there and would be involved in an active war zone if Trump and Hegseth and Marco Rubio can't get the deal done they want at the table. And so far, Maduro and the Venezuelan people are holding tight there. And not giving into the immediate demands. So I wanted to kind of talk through some of those, fill in some more timeline pieces that are there, and kind of keep driving on what Tom just spoke to, which is every time the people of Venezuela, the government of Venezuela has been confronted with a problem, either internal or external, they've come up with a Bolivarian solution to it. Venezuela's National Democratic Revolution has been defeating U.S. intervention for over a quarter century by confronting those problems with popular power and organization. As Tom mentioned, you've got the PSUV as a party created to take on the problem of a lack of unity across multiple progressive and left forces, and to unite at a higher level of organization with 7 guiding principles about how do we actually implement these ideas of revolution, of popular power, of a communal state, of an armed forces that is nationalized and has a very different ideological training and orientation to its people, as well as rewriting their constitution so it doesn't serve the interests of the capitalist powers and compradors who just want to let land go fallow and hoard and gouge products and things like that to make the economy scream from within. When 2002 happened and Comandante Chavez was attacked, it was the people and loyal military who rallied to his defense and came to defend their own revolution and the path forward. It seems it is a long time ago, and we wouldn't be here today in this type of situation if the people hadn't rallied heroically to defend their president. Later on in that same year, there was an oil worker strike and lockout. The AFL-CIA was in there with the Solidarity Center and other actors trying to lock out slash strike to shut down Venezuela's key nationalized industry of oil, which deprives it of its wealth to give back to the people through educational, healthcare, social programs, and things like that. So what did they do? He came up with a Bolivarian solution. Let's investigate who's doing all this stuff, fire the rats, and hire new workers and leadership who are aligned to the people and their problems. Then they come up with these popular militias, and the popular militias are integrated at the higher levels with the national armed forces, which sit at close to 200,000 personnel within the country between National Guard, Army, military, Air Force, and reservists. And there's, what they've said is they've almost doubled the amount of Venezuelans enrolled in these popular militias. I think we saw some of those great photos and reels coming out on social media of like old nanas with rifles training and getting ready to defend their neighborhoods, their barrios from the Yankee invaders. As things moved on, they saw a police force in need of training and certainly equipment, and they moved around it and created a national force, much like they did to reorient the military to root out rats and traitors, whether they be just corrupt, crooked folks, or they're kind of more active counter-revolutionaries. I'll give a quick example about that. When I lived in Venezuela a number of years ago, I was all the way out on the east side of the country, pretty remote area, living in one of the many small indigenous villages out there. And in the village, there was kind of a medic or a doctor. And when, little kids were getting sick or other people needed medicine, and they're like, well, we got to wait a long time when they don't have any, and or that things cost an amount of money. Knowing that there might be some dynamics, I tried to curiously ask, like, I don't mean to be rude, but I thought I heard healthcare was free, and they're like, it is, but the distribution networks go through either governors or the military, and there's some people who don't think their salary's high enough, and they'll pocket the medicine and sell it on the black market. And some of that is because they're just greedy. Others were just traitors and wanted to make the revolution look bad. And this is 15 years ago. So what do you do in those types of situations? And granted, that was 8 years removed from a coup. Well, it's working on the training, and it's growing a party from bottom up to ideologically change the orientation of how armed forces and the military should be serving defense of their people and not capital and private property. So moving through that, kind of jumping past into the unfortunate post-Chavez era, 2014 saw some nasty interventions in February with the guarimbos, or these road blockades that were later replicated with the tranques in Nicaragua in 2018. And these are anti-popular forces. They're oppositional groups. They're often lumpen characters and things like that. But one thing I wanted to share is I think we know that media can be manipulated. And this was definitely a case at that time, 10 plus years ago, when seeing on, progressive left people across social media sharing this image of this like hulking, almost Judge Dredd looking police officer with like a club in his hand and dragging a protester, and people are like, oh my gosh, look at like the Venezuelans, of course they're cracking down, they're authoritarian. Well, somebody did their homework, and that photo was from Spain, 2005. And so these are the kind of media manipulations we always got to be on high guard, especially as Trump has found to be unpopular with this attempt at war. There's 76% of the people don't even believe his bullshit about these drug strikes and any of this narco trafficking stuff. And so, like Meredith said, we gotta claim that message. We got out there and call out their bullshit and tell the truth about what's actually going on there and defend this revolution best we can. So as 2014 also hit ahead, there was price gouging, there was hoarding of food. So they took food off shelves, driving up the prices. Hyperinflation went through the roof. They had warehouses full of eggs, toilet paper, cooking oil, milk, flour, and all sorts of different powder products needed for Venezuelan meals. And they put them inside of armed warehouses and just held it back to make it look like there was some sort of economic crisis. 14 was also when they got Saudi Arabia to drop the price of oil way down to try and really bring Venezuela to its knees. And so the work of that party, the work of President Maduro, and the work of the Venezuelan people united, heavily organized, ready to defend their revolution, not only in 14, in 18, and assassination attempts and invasion attempts in 19 and 20, and trying to like install different people at every step of the way. They've overcome the sanctions. And in 25 years, the Venezuelan people, their party, the Bolivarian Revolution, are ready to hand U.S. imperialism another Vietnam if they invade. They stand behind their democratically elected president. They're armed and ready to defend their homeland. Que viva Venezuela. Thank you.
Viva! Hasta la victoria! Thank you so much, Jim. That was an incredible presentation. Drones blowing out the power system, food hoarding, sanctions, just outright killings, and the Venezuelan people will not go down. And we will make sure that everything we do is in lockstep with the Venezuelan people in the world who insist on being free. So thank you so much to our incredible speakers of the night. We're going to ask the questions now that have been sent to us. And there's quite a few, so get ready, y'all. Okay, let's see. So we'll start with a question from Philip in San Jose. And then it doesn't specify a panelist, so whoever wants to answer it can take a stab. How does Maria Machado come into play in regard to the message that we want to send out in these actions? Could she be a primary target depending on conditions? Yeah, go ahead, Meredith.
I think that she's a really great way to reach out to people in the anti-war movement because she's been super pro-Trump and she's been super pro-Netanyahu, and I think that she's super pro-Israel, and I think that that's been a really great tool because if she's been very supportive of the genocide of the Palestinian people, how can she be this great defender of human rights? Like, how can she be a Nobel Peace Prize recipient? But also, how can she be someone who is worthy of a Nobel Peace Prize if she's also advocating for the US to come and invade her own country? There's no such thing as a peaceful invasion. So I think that that sort of gets people to think about what does the opposition movement really have in terms of any credibility at all. And so I think that she sort of gets people to think about when people start to hear those things, I think it gets people to think about, oh, what type of lies am I being sold to sort of get me to want to believe in this justification for, attacking these boats, being pro, invasion, like, where does this train of logic lead me to go? And so I think it can be good for sort of starting to get people to think for themselves.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. Um, so she's a terrible person and a great talking point, is what I'm hearing. Are there any more panelists who want to speak to this? If not, we can just move on to the next question. Okay, so let's move on to the next question. All right, so it's Rick from Texas asking from Dallas. The question I wanted to ask is that the composition of the left that is being principally by the PSUV. Okay, let me read this word for word. Hey, comrades, thank you for this excellent presentation. I wanted to ask, is that the composition of the left that is being principally by the PSUV has opposition from certain sectors? Oh, so if the composition of the left that is the PSUV, if it has opposition from certain sectors despite the heavy arm of imperialism attacking Venezuela. And so my question was, what is the current relationship between the communist CPV and the PSUV as this current U.S. aggression grows? So the relationship between the CPV and the PSUV and what resistance the PSUV faces. Does anyone want to answer that?
Yeah, I'll answer that. So it's not a good situation if you're in the old Communist Party because you have to choose. You either have to choose the Communist Party that's pro-Chavista, pro-Maduro, pro-PSUV, and aligns with it, or you have to choose the other Communist Party with the same name that calls Maduro a neoliberal, says that he's serving foreign interest, says that he's repressive and undemocratic, says all the things that the right wingers say about the revolution, you know? And so, currently we know people, I'm quite close with the guy who's in the leadership of the party that's anti-Maduro, but I stopped talking to him after my last trip there. And I also know people and have friends who are in the pro PSUV, pro Bolivarian Revolution CPV. So what happened was a series of legal proceedings that defined which party was the legitimate party, and you can kind of go through it if that's what you're of the mind to do. But there were a lot of discrepancies in how the party was being run and funded, and its processes in terms of internal democracy. And so that all ended up in court, and the courts ruled that, the anti-Chavista ones weren't in charge of it anymore. They handed it to the folks who are pro-Chavista. So that's the current standing. So you might read two different statements from, a party with the same name. So that's where it's at right now. And just to say, neither of those parties is very big or powerful, given that, on May Day, the PSUV will get 2 million people out in the streets of Caracas, Even when the party was united and pro-Chavista, we went to the pre-rally and spoke at it, and there were about 150 to 200 people, And that's when they were having good times, so versus 2 million. So, you know, I've been in a small group most of my life, so I don't discount small groups of people who are determined to make revolution. But I think we all know the revolution's being led from Maduro's seat in the presidential palace.
100%. Thank you so much, Tom. Do any of the other panelists want to speak to this question? Okay. If not, we'll go ahead and move right along. Okay, so from Faye in Fort Worth, Texas, can you speak more to the private property relations in Venezuela and what progress the PSUV has made in the past few decades towards the progress of socialism, and what ways they've protected the workers against class conflict in the process? So, property relations in Venezuela. Any of the other speakers who haven't spoken? Yeah, go ahead.
All right. I know for sure in kind of some of the early few years, like early 2000s, as Chavez elected and really started in '99 with a whole new constitution, that they knew there was a lot of land laying fallow in Venezuela. And they were importing somewhat to like close to 90% of their food and they're looking around like, we got all this land and we've got like people who know how to grow food and lots of people who aren't are looking for different forms of employment. That was part of the consequences of that neoliberal structural adjustment program that hit in the 70s and the 80s. And so they were offering those landowners money, and they're like, all right, but also if you got productive land left fallow, if you're not going to offer it to us, we're going to start taking it. And so there's that aspect of grabbing up that land, purchasing it, and then they also there are people who knew how to grow food. But then they also were like not enough people, and so they grew a lot of like technical colleges as they expanded post-secondary education. They passed a lot of biological and organic laws to try and grow healthy food as well, and not use the typical stuff that gets made on U.S. corporate farms. That's one aspect of it. But there's in some of the more remote regions and further away from Bolivarian sources of power, some of there still are campesino issues. But those have started to been handled through better organization, campesino organizations, and support. Those were probably late 20 teens and early 2020s to address some of those peasant questions. They've taken a lot of the wealth from the nationalization of oil and used it towards creating productive enterprises and actual industries that can manufacture things, engineering plants, making not only making cooking oil and things like that on their own. So very much an internal development growth with it, and lots of working class organizations and unions at all of those places participating in that way. They do have a number of different organic laws, as they call them, in their constitution about how business should go and enterprises and things like that. But that still remains the work of the revolution, which is to really grab more of the means of production, really grab more private property, and especially the financial institutions like banks, and get on a different system that's away from the petrodollar and things like that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. Tom, I see you unmuting. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to say, I regularly talk to people in Caracas. I've only been about an hour and a half, 2 hours outside of it at any time. We visited a large printing press, that had been owned by a Argentinian corporation that abandoned it. So the workers took it over and were running it. But when we were there, we were talking with people, and people in the city also say that there's as many as 4 million Colombians who have moved into Venezuela over the past 20 years to farm, 4 million people. So you don't hear about that in the news. You only hear about people leaving the country. But that, there is a neighborhood to the east of Caracas called Petare that is 500,000 Colombian people, born in Colombia. But that's Venezuelans and Colombians. They consider each other cousins, and they're very welcoming to each other to move within their countries. Um, there's a lot of new industries that have been built. So the things I'm familiar with firsthand is there's motorcycles that are sold in other countries now. There's a big aluminum industry that was built with investments that Chavez began. And I'm just going to say, I think they had foresight about why would you want to have an aluminum industry? Well, if you know that the U.S. is eventually going to threaten you with war, you might want to build things that are easy to fly. And so I don't know that for a fact. I'm just someone who tries to think about things and put them together. And yes, Meredith, I read The Economist for 25 years every week. So I agree with you about The Economist, but it also has a lot of raw information that's helpful to understand the economy. Um, they're a country that's on the march. They've had 18 quarters of growth, and some of that growth is, small percentage points, some's larger, and it comes after really devastating impacts of the sanctions, but they're like Muhammad Ali, fly like a butterfly, sting like a bee, and the U.S. better be careful. So,
Awesome. Thanks so much to our panelists. Yeah, they're trying to advance their productive forces, and there's a leadership question, right? Uh, and we want to see working class leadership for sure. All right. Let's see. Wow, we have so many questions, y'all. That's awesome. We'll go next to David Pulido from Orange County. I was wondering if a speaker could elaborate on how the Venezuelan left is trying to gain more control of their economy. Please feel free to frame this question more appropriately. Um, they say they're very ignorant on the subject, but now they've heard a bunch of presentations, so they won't be. ignorant anymore. Is there more that panelists want to speak about this? I think it's been answered at least partially. Venezuelan left getting control. Okay, David gives a thumbs up. Cool. Thanks so much. Rolling right along. Okay, from Lena in Minnesota, how do we determine the right balance to strike between organizing Venezuela-centric actions versus Palestine-centric actions? So for all the anti-war activists in the House, how do we strike the balance? Yeah, go ahead.
I think that's like the $25 million question, and I totally understand Lena's question. And so like I think Human Rights Day, for example, lends us an opportunity to be able to, deal with both at the same time. Um, I think that some of it has to do with like what's in the news. Like, for example, like I think we've been given a real moment for the fact that they were actually talking about like, you know, the double tap, like, is this been a war crime? And I think that what has been happening in Palestine is a war crime. Like, so you could have, for example, an opportunity to talk about like, stop funding war crimes, and you could talk about both places. I mean, I think there's ways to draw those connections to both. Um, I think that it's important, and I think the benefit of talking about both at the same time is it does give us the opportunity to, again, trying to train people to think like consistent anti-imperialists as opposed to just to be like, oh, look, here's the US doing a really bad thing this one place here. And like that was a problem that we did have during the US war in Iraq, like where people would be like, oh, Bush is being just so mean. And it's like, no, he's not being mean. This is like actually US policy for a reason. Um, but I do think it is really challenging. And I think that what one way that we've dealt with in the anti-war committee is, Lena, is sort of like having different subcommittees to be able to sort of like have different groups of people sort of work on different things. Um, but I would love to hear from the other panelists too, like how you can sort of deal with a multi-pronged imperialism at the same time, because unfortunately the US does have the ability to destroy to terrorize lots of different groups of people at the same time. So Lena deserves an answer from someone not from Minnesota, because Lena's from Minnesota.
All right, non-Minnesotan panelists, how do we strike the balance? Who wants to take a stab at it? Only Meredith knew the answer. Only Minnesota knows. People trying to be shy, be nice.
Poor Lena.
And if we're doing both, we should say we're doing both. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
Sure. I think the I also organize with our Tucson Anti-War Committee, and we're getting ready for running a campaign against a manufacturer who contributes to the F-35 that rains hellfire over used by Israel and contributes to the genocide through bombing, death, destruction, and just hawking the skies and trying to probably intercept Yemeni missiles and stuff like that, but fails to do that. Great. But the U.S. also uses F-35s to hawk the shores of Venezuela as well. Israel has trained with U.S. forces and Colombian forces, which can be, have historically been used to try and sort of, as Meredith said, be sort of a U.S. bulwark against the so-called pink tide and any progressive and left forces trying to break away from U.S. imperial wranglings. But I think it's kind of knowing those issues and drawing those similar connections of like, these are just kind of people trying to liberate themselves and live their own lives, self-determined. And it's a similar logic, and I think knowing that what Trump says about Palestinians and what he thinks, both in this current administrative term and the previous one, talking points to bring there, but I think it's really a chance for us to show those connections across this system that we have a common enemy, as Comrade Carlos said, and that there's these ties that are woven together, whether that's in Latin America or in the Middle East or in East Asia. And so defending those is supporting those, and it helps us here at the United States raise all those issues and start to sort of raise the level of organization and consciousness amongst ourselves so we can broaden that fight together.
Awesome. Thank you, Jim. Yeah, we want to raise that consciousness. All right. So, because of the plethora of questions, let's take the next one. So, from Druzy in San Jose, hello, they're wondering if anyone could talk about other left governments or forces in Latin America and their relationship solidarity with Venezuela throughout U.S. attacks and vice versa, Venezuela's solidarity with others in Latin America against U.S. attacks. Yeah, more about anti-imperialist forces in Latin America. Yes, Meredith.
Well, I think that the US is in a pickle in that I think it would be in a very different situation if Colombia was still a US ally, because they could then go through Colombia to attack Venezuela, and but they can't do that this time. Like, whereas several of the other times that they've tried to organize coups against Maduro, they've been able to send forces through Colombia, but they can't do that this time. And so, and a matter of fact, one thing that's also been hurting the US's efforts in the Caribbean is that the the Caribbean is that Colombia has also just said, you know what? One of the consequences of this is that we're not cooperating with you on intel. Like, if you actually care about drugs, you need to work with us, because actually most of the drugs are coming through our country. And so F you, we're not cooperating with you. So if you actually want intel about drugs, you're not getting it now. So good luck with that. And then actually the UK and the Netherlands have also withdrawn any of their intel about what's going on in the Caribbean. And so it's been really interesting that they're like actual like cooperation like consequences in terms of diplomatic that like are actually making it harder for the US to actually do things around drugs, which actually calls into question if this was ever about drugs, which we know is true. It's never about drugs. It was always about like geopolitical control, oil, and like getting rid of a government that dares to like question like the US's capitalist order. But I think that the situation with Colombia has been very interesting because he definitely is a part of sort of like also providing, you know, a no guy in the region, like, so it's not just Maduro that says no to the US now. And the US has never had no from Colombia. Like, that is just sort of like a totally new thing. And I'll turn it over to Carlos.
Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
No, absolutely. Petro, the president of Colombia, he's been very vocal, standing in solidarity with Venezuela, saying we're a united people. If you, you even said if you attack Venezuela, we'll defend Venezuela. So that is a major development. I was in Colombia, before the peace treaty was signed. They had a very right wing government at that time, Uribe. So it's awesome development that the mass movement was able to elect Petro. And then, you got the BRIC nations, you got Brazil, you got China, Russia that are in the forming economic political alliances that are supporting Venezuela. Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, has said, has criticized Trump in his attack on Venezuela, and also says, you can't attack, also can't attack Mexico. We're a sovereign nation, and this whole idea of attacking cartels, whether it's Mexico or Venezuela, she denounced that. And several years ago, we had a conference in Tijuana with. It was a Solidarity Workers Conference against U.S. imperialism, where Cuba trade union workers were there, Venezuelanos were there, and the Cubans and a lot of Mexican revolutionary groups were there. And we had a big delegation from California. We had FRSO there, Central CSO was there, and we learned a lot, and we formed relationships and solidarity. So, yeah, Venezuela is not alone. It's got a lot of solidarity support from Mexico, Colombia, and of course, we live in the belly of the beast, so we have a special responsibility to, stand in solidarity with Venezuela, Palestine, and all the oppressed nations of the world to unite against U.S. imperialism, our main enemy of the peoples of the world. Thank you. Back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much to our panelists. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, like Carlos said, the main three that stick together are Nicaragua, Venezuela, and Cuba, with Cuba, being the most advanced society in terms of its relationships. It doesn't really have a capitalist class like the other two, but the other two are still struggling to, overcome imperialism, um, in a way that Cuba has already defeated. So I want to say, though, that you have these left-wing governments that win elections, Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil, and other countries too, Uruguay for a while. But those are like social democratic left-wing governments. That's how I would describe them, and they vary depending on the country and the dynamics of the movements there. But like the president of Chile would say he's a social democrat, but I would use Jim's word. I'd say he's mostly a rat. When the U.S. says jump, he says how high. And a year ago, with BRICS, Venezuela had applied. And there's other countries, socialist countries that, China's part of it. Vietnam's, I know they're looking at it, but the person who sank Venezuela's entry to BRICS, which would have solved a lot of their financial problems on an international level in terms of banking, right? Like would have dramatically boosted their economy and its ability to function. It was the president of Brazil, Lula, who people consider kind of a darling. President Obama said he's the best politician ever to live. But Lula has some kind of deal with somebody that he wasn't going to let Venezuela in the door to BRICS. So people should not view BRICS as anything other than, a series of trade relationships between very differing countries with very differing societies, and not as some kind of block that's going to make imperialism decay in front of our eyes. That's not what it's doing. So, yeah. So it's I'm going to say keep your eyes open and pay attention to what the maneuvers are country by country versus imperialism.
Awesome. Thank you for breaking out those facts, Tom. All right. So our next question from Aif. Can one of the panelists speak to the similarities between the Iraq War and what could happen if the U.S. goes to war with Venezuela? You're pointing, but I don't know if it's the same person. I can see.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
like
okay.
when you do the pointing thing, Tom, it's not really referencing for anyone else, just to let you know.
It's just
Um,
funny.
it's okay. So I think there are a lot of similarities between this and the Iraq War, and that like the US was targeting Iraq because again, they wouldn't let the US just go after their natural resources. Um, it was in many ways also a progressive government. Um, and so like many people here don't know, if you weren't around then, that like at the time Iraq actually had the highest rate of education for women of any country in the Middle East. And they were using, for example, their oil resources to do things like provide education for people. Was it like the most egalitarian society of all time? No. But they had some progressive things going on. Um, so the US like had the no-fly zone, that was the same. The targeted sanctions, right? That was the same. Um, and the sanctions disproportionately hurt people who were the most vulnerable, like people under the age of 3 and people who are senior citizens. And I think that's also true for what's going on in Venezuela, because if you, for example, are really young or really old, I think you're the most vulnerable to not getting in medicines or, for example, having the electrical outages that happen sometimes because of the US cyber attacks and things like that. Um, and there's some other comparisons that I wanted to make, but they left my small brain. Now I'm tired. Sorry. But I do think I have been seeing a lot of similarities in terms of like also like the buildup in terms of like the way lies and propaganda and demonization. Like so like when we were building up for the war in Iraq, they made it seem like if we dropped bombs that they would only kill Saddam Hussein, which first of all was just bizarre. Like that's not how bombs work. And they similarly, like when Trump is talking about it, he makes it sound like the bombs would only fall on Nicolas Maduro, and that's also not how bombs work. And so they make it sound like there's one guy is just so evil, and we should be able to just drop these bombs, and like there's no one else is gonna get hurt, and but they're so bad it just justifies doing anything. And so the packaging of the rhetoric, I also feel like is a real similarity.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. Yeah, go ahead, Carlos.
Yeah, well, I mean, with Iraq, it was the total major lie of weapons of mass destruction. They had Colin Powell go to the UN, right? And now we see him as a fool. But we have to watch out, that the U.S. has used incidents. Vietnam was the Gulf of Tonkin, where they supposedly accused the Vietnamese of attacking one of the U.S. navies. The Spanish-American War, the sinking, what was the name of that boat? The Maine? Was it the Maine? No, I don't remember, But
Yeah.
so yeah,
Yeah.
was it the Maine? Yeah, so they use that excuse that the boat, blew up in the harbor and they attacked, took over Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Spanish colonies. So I'm just afraid that stupid ass Trump or Rubio is going to use some. People call it a false flag incident. Somebody's going to start shooting something. They're going to say, "Oh, we got shot at. Now we got to defend ourselves." We have to watch out for that. And it's getting really hot with the way they're bombing those fishing boats. In the Caribbean. I've been to the small little islands in the Caribbean off between Colombia and Nicaragua. And anyway, so yeah, so we have to, denounce any of these false flag incidents that they try to use. Yeah, back to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Carlos. Yeah, we should remember where the violence has always come from, right?
Yeah,
It's
including
not Maduro's
invasion of
government.
Mexico. They used an incident on the border with Mexico to invade, take half the territory of Mexico, right? I forgot about that one.
Going way back.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. So we do still have more questions. So what we'll do because of time is we'll just take one answer for each of these questions. But that way, everyone who submitted a question will get an answer. Okay. So next from Daniel Castillo from Green Bay, Wisconsin, they're asking, how should we engage with social democrats, such as in the DSA, who acquiesce to imperialist narratives about Venezuelan democracy, but also don't want war? So how do we engage with these forces?
All right.
Okay.
Go, Meredith.
You go.
Hugo Chavez. Um, I mean, we do mass organizing. So if people want to join in on mass organizing, we're welcoming and friendly and good. But at the same time, when it comes to forums or, you know, one-on-one discussions or, struggle in a meeting over what what our orientation is, I think we take the revolutionary road. And we don't allow people to say, criticize the leaders of countries that the U.S. is going to war with, and especially not ones who are revolutionaries and for socialism. We defend them. We stand with them. Mick Kelly likes to say Bernie Sanders' socialism stops at the border. Well, we blow right over the border and disregard it. We're for socialism for everybody. So that's the basic answer. So we have to struggle for ideas, and that's part of our work. It's not the main thing, and you probably won't do so well if you focus on the internet doing it, but we do some there too. Maybe we need to write more polemics of FRSO against DSA and against PSL. That's an idea I've been thinking about this week. Write more hit pieces on their lousy politics. So,
Ooh, keep your eyes open, everyone. Thanks so much, Sam. We'll put that poison pen to work. All right, so we'll take our next question from Joseph Heller. What kind of political organizing is happening among the Venezuelan diaspora in the U.S., and how closely is the FRSO and AWON working with them? Do we see any Venezuelans in our work? Yeah, go ahead, Meredith.
I think that most of the Venezuelan population in the United States is similar to most of the Colombian population in the United States, which is that most of the Venezuelan population that has in the United States is here because they are of an upper class background, so they could afford to leave. And a lot of people left because, for example, they didn't like the direction that the country was going. A lot of the Venezuelans that are in this country are much more politically aligned with the Cuban population that is in the United States. And so, for example, we have found progressive Venezuelans that are in this country to work with, but like in all honesty, there have been lots of right-wing Venezuelans on this issue that we have had to actually you know, deal with counter protesting at our events. Part of it has, and it really comes down to class. That like when I, have talked with people about what was their class position back in Venezuela, I'm like, oh, that's why we're in disagreement about this, is that you are not from the group of people that would have actually benefited from these programs that Maduro or Chavez is putting in, in motion. And that's why we're having a disagreement about this, like because we're a different, we have a different, class analysis of like what's going on with the revolution. And so I'm not saying obviously that every Venezuelan who lives in the United States has that class perspective, because like that's ridiculous. But I'm just saying that I think that whereas, for example, when I used to do El Salvador work, most of the Salvadorans that I met when I was doing El Salvador work in like the 1990s, most of the Salvadorans I met actually were on the same page with me in terms of like doing El Salvador work, because they had been forced out of their country because of U.S. warfare. And like they were here in the United States and they were working class Salvadorans, and they were here as like refugees from a war. And so I think it's just important to have in mind what's the class and like analysis, and like are they here as refugees, and are they here because they were forced out, or are they here because they had the means to leave like on an airplane? There you go. That's what I have to say.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Meredith. And in Orlando, folks actually had an event to say hands off Venezuela, and there were some Venezuelans who tried to get it canceled. They tried to pressure the venue to cancel our event, and we would not let them. And we had the event. So she's 100% right. All right. So we have a question from Kathleen. Are lots of Cuban medics still in Venezuela? Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
I believe so. I'd be surprised if they're not. There's a lot of exchanges that happen. I was there with a delegation of 4 or 5 Teamsters the week that COVID hit the U.S. and we uh, we were trying to go home in the morning when the airport got shut down. We were at the airport early because we knew it might happen, but we scrambled and they put us on an airplane. I asked them to put us on an airplane to Cuba, and just dumb luck, it turned out. But we flew on a plane of medical personnel, nurses, doctors, and they were very generous to let us share the flight back to Cuba, and that's how we got back. We were able to buy a flight from Cuba to Fort Lauderdale, but COVID had hit hard, so they shut down everything. But that's a few years ago. But I assume they're still there, and there's a lot of educational exchanges, a lot of on multiple levels. More so than with any other country. The solidarity and the bond is strong.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Tom. Yeah, the friendship's still alive. We've got 2 questions left, everyone, and then we're going to go ahead and end our program. The next question is from Kevin Heaton. Is anything happening in Boston? Um, so for those who are in a national network, if they know of anything happening in Boston, uh, folks can say so. If you are in Boston and you know of something happening, you should tell us and write to us on our website, frso.org/join, and we'll connect you. And if something's not already happening, we'll make it happen. But I guess we'll
We do
see.
not have
Yeah,
any
go ahead.
Awan affiliates in Boston, but we would love to have one, but we don't. So I don't have anything to answer. I'm sorry.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Meredith. But if you are in Boston, Kevin, which it sounds like you are, please write to us and we'll help you put on an event. All right. And then this will take us to our last question of the night from Angel in Chicago. To what extent is this threat of war against Venezuela tied to U.S. empire's new Cold War on China? Solidarity to the Bolivarian Revolution from Chicago. Is there any relationship to the U.S.'s aggression on China?
Jim Byrne.
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
Well, if we had a second speaker for the Cuban doctors one, I had a story about having diarrhea where I was, but I'll save that one for now. I'll take the China one, I guess. No, 100%, comrade, it is. Well, I'd say maybe 90%. It's a fair amount is clearly seeing Venezuela on its own as its own thing. I mean, from 2002, the United States already wanted to get rid of this thing, and that was clearly before China made its massive leap in industrial production and economic juggernaut that it is today. So it's always been on its radar since the revolution's infancy. But it is definitely a shift in ruling class tactics from the pivot to Asia that Obama started in his administration. Putting like 2,000 Marines in Australia is certainly something, but it's not 15,000 people and multiple airstrike, over 20 airstrikes, and closing in on 100 dead, and just the world's biggest aircraft. I do think it's a little bit kind of like Trump's use of the mother of all bombs in Afghanistan as a massive saber rattling. But it's Venezuela sort of in particular, but in general, it is that move to see that that the imperialists and the ruling capitalist class are not able to beat they can't carry out their agenda in the Middle East, in East Asia, right? Trump's trying to ramp up deals in South Korea to keep an eye, of course, on China over there. But Trump shifted the tactics to try and invade Venezuela in his first term, went around, sort of shopping around the idea there. But they know that, if you were to read the Southern Command's lead general's position paper in February in his presentation to Congress, China is the first country listed. It is peppered all throughout as threats to the region, U.S. national interests, and things like that. They know that over 20 countries out of the 30 in Latin America are a part of the Belt and Road Initiative. China's a major investor and trade partner. They're at least number two, if not number one, in tons of other Latin American countries. Not only are they building ports, railroads, infrastructure, hospitals, and other key infrastructural developments in there, they're then reciprocating by being a market for a lot of the Latin American agricultural products as well. So it's a way to flex on China in this way, but of course the United States and its ruling class knows no other way than blood and murder and terror. It's to keep an eye on, but it's definitely hands off solidarity. But we know the grand chessboard is to try and make a move against China.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jim. And with that powerful statement that the U.S. is not going to keep winning and they're meeting up with powerful opposition, whether it's anti-imperialists in Latin America or socialists all across Asia, or homegrown revolutionaries right in their own borders. Their day is coming to an end, and I think we're going to see more and more wins over the future, hard-won wins. So with that said, thank you everyone for being on our call. If you haven't joined yet, the Freedom Road Socialist Organization, please go onto our website, frso.org/join. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to help you put on events so we can keep saying no to war on Venezuela. And thank you so much to our speakers of the night for a fantastic program. And thanks, as always, to Andy, our national organizer, for the fantastic tech and question organizing. Thank you everyone for being on. Hasta la victoria siempre. No war on Venezuela. See you all in the streets. Human Rights Day. Bye.
Viva la revolución. Thank
Viva
you.
la revolución.
Viva.